Sports.
Welcome to another episode of Debatable with your hosts, Nina and Kyle. I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle.
And with us is Ferdin.
Hi, I'm Ferdin.
Ferdin is the recently crowned champion, the second best speaker of the Northern Luzon InterVarsity, which Nina also won, so congratulations to Ferdin also.
Yay!
He's also the Vice President of the Philippine Debate Union, and he's a resident Mr. Sports.
Yes.
He's also a heartthrob, according to many of you.
That's not true.
You're just humble, I think.
Okay, so what are we going to talk about? If you haven't guessed it yet through all our teasers and the fact that Ferdin's here, we're going to talk about sports.
So Ferdin, why do ad scores even set sports motions?
Well, first off, I think it's very interesting because there are a lot of issues concerning sports, and sports matters to a lot of people. Like for me, it matters a lot to me, and probably not to most debaters, but outside debate, sports matter to a lot of people.
And that's why we're debaters, because we can't sport for anything.
Well, debate's a sport, if you think about it.
That's true.
Which is also why I think it's important to know about this. Like, if we're gonna fight that debate should be taken seriously, we might as well know why. Yes. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is, because we absolutely know nothing about this, is Ferdin, we want you to tell us about the technicalities, common mistakes people have when debating sports motions, terms that people misuse all the time. I'm pretty sure that's a pet peeve of yours, so have the floor.
Alright, so when Kyle asked me to discuss what sports leagues are, the first thing I noticed was that he didn't know the difference between a club and a league. So,
There's a difference?
there's a difference, right?
Okay.
To be fair, in the Philippines, it's not that usual because we don't have clubs in the Philippines. But I think the best example for this is Barcelona, right? Barcelona is a club, and Barcelona has a lot of teams in different sports. So Barcelona has a team in basketball, Barcelona has a team in football.
Okay, so a club can participate in many different sports.
In many different sports, yes. And the sports they participate in are what we call leagues, right? So, for example, Barcelona plays
It's blowing my mind.
La Liga, which
Okay.
is the Spanish football league. So, basically, a club is sometimes synonymous to a team, and clubs/teams play in leagues.
Oh, so it's
Okay.
like when Mineski plays in different games, different types of games. So you have the Dota, so you have the CS:GO.
Yeah. That's it. So, like, if Mineski has different teams with different kinds of like computer games, that's how it works. Also for at least like most countries outside the Philippines. But in the Philippines, clubs are synonymous to teams.
I only know next to nothing.
No, that's
Absolutely
esports. Esports can be seen as a sport. I mean, there has been debates about having esports in the Olympics, so
Yeah.
you're not that far off.
Yeah, but I think the difference is, and I think this is where we go more general, that's specific to professional sports. But there's also a very important other facet of sports, which is amateur sports. And the difference is that there's no pay, right? You play because either you're part of a school team, like the UAAP or NCAA, and then you get either scholarships or you get recruited. So basically the difference is you're not paid for playing. But in professional sports, you are paid for playing.
That's also part of like what we debate sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So, do you think it's fair, personally?
Well, for me, I think the pay, quote unquote, just comes in a different form. Like sometimes it comes in the form of scholarships, or sometimes they get like bonuses like cars, houses, or whatever. And it's not as if these athletes are not very well off, right? They get a lot of other opportunities as well.
Yeah, but I also heard that the opportunities that they do get and the education they receive, they don't get to enjoy it so much because, first of all, they can't really study so much because they spend most of their time training. They also have to enroll in BS classes, like Sohibi classes. I got this from John Oliver.
Okay, continue.
Yeah, but that's also true because like a lot of, especially in the US, if you're a really good basketball player in college, you are most likely not going to finish college because you want to turn pro as soon as possible. So the benefit does not exist for these good players, which is like counterintuitive to why these good players actually exist in
So
college.
there's like a trade-off most times.
So most times. So sometimes when you go pro, you didn't actually finish any degree. So after like retiring, it's hard for you to actually make sure that you get a lot of money or like stay stable.
So there's not a lot of things that are stable with these athletes. Maybe just like the support they get.
That's true, yeah. Or the endorsements after. Like if they're really popular. But if you're the subpar, like not really subpar, but you're like the
Mid-tier,
average, mid-tier, you won't really get much after retiring.
Because only if you're like Shaq.
Yeah, Shaq. Even Shaq finished college after playing. So, yeah. And then the second thing is probably the transition to professional sports. Because like there are a lot of ways for you to transition from amateur to professional. So I think the more like relevant example to the Philippines is the rookie draft, which is more popular in basketball. After you finish, or sometimes after you opt out of college, you can opt in the draft, wherein like there's like a lottery for teams as to who they can pick from the pool of players who opted in the draft. But okay, sorry.
I'm just staring at Ferdin. I don't understand.
Okay,
anything.
so like basically it's a player opting in a pool, and that pool is wherein teams can select the players they want. That's why they're called rookies because they're new.
See.
But for some sports like football, they don't have drafts. They just have recruitment. So sometimes they get recruited under academies as early as 12 years old, 13 years old. And then they get developed through their teenage years until they get elevated to the professional team or the A team. So it's a bit different. There are a lot of issues behind it as well. Like first and foremost, like young players going to Europe just to train for certain clubs.
Or like I heard in China, like they really grow their athletes from birth.
Yeah, so it's like grooming as well. Right?
From birth.
Oh yeah, for Olympic athletes.
For the Olympics.
So they're like being groomed to be really, really good athletes.
Yes.
Sometimes they don't have any path besides that. Yeah.
I remember that argument. NLIV.
NLIV quarterfinal.
Yeah, except we were grooming them to be pop stars. Now it's just about grooming them to be athletes.
Yes.
Okay, so those are the technicalities.
Yeah.
I'm they're still too technical for me, but I think that like shed a lot of light. So the next thing we want to discuss, I think, happens in most debates, which are like the social issues aspect. And like I'd like to think that the politicalization of sports is not unique. In fact, it's kind of embedded in sports. A lot of examples prove this, like how boxing was inherently racist because they used slaves and pit them against each other because of the belief that Black individuals were not worthy to be seen as athletes. It's like sabong, but for people, basically. Yeah. Or how the Olympics was created because of a political purpose. It was there to unify nations.
The different Greek city-states. From what I read before, the reason why sports is so competitive is because it used to be a proxy for war, especially in the origin of the Olympics. Instead of them actually going to war with each other, they decided to hold this sporting event where they sort of competed on behalf of their city-state, which is why the Olympics is inherently political. Like it originated for political reasons.
It's like Hunger Games, but for Greek city-states, right?
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah, so I'd like to think that sports and social issues are inherently linked. So what we want to do, the three of us, for this episode is to sort of break those issues down and make them a lot more palatable. So sports and nationality.
There are a lot. Like I don't know where to start, honestly. But I think though it's very important to just pitch in just a very important characteristic of sports, at least in comparison to other debates we have, right? And it's the concept of fans. And the concept of fans is that it's like it makes sports very dynamic because clubs won't exist without the fans. Like they're the bloodline of whatever sports there are, right?
Yes.
And it's very important to like understand how they can influence or what the relationship is with other issues in sports such as nationality or sex. Because most of the behavior of clubs or teams are influenced by what fans want them to do. Right? So sometimes it goes to the extremes like hooliganism. So they actually become violent, they protest, they boycott, etc. Despite that, their demand is very inelastic. No matter what their teams do, they will still continue watching them because it's something that they really want watching, something they really have deep connection with.
Like, no exceptions?
Well, there are certain exceptions, like especially if you're really, really crazy. Like if you're a manager of a team and you're really crazy, sometimes fans will boycott, but it's less likely to happen because they obviously want to watch their team as much as possible and as often as possible.
Why do you think this bond is formed? Like, it's only in sports where I see this intense version of fans. Like, their dedication, the amount of money they're willing to spend for their teams.
Yeah.
It's insanely different from other fields. Supporting a celebrity or supporting like a movement. What makes sports so different? Like, why do you think people are so attached to it?
Well, I think a lot of reasons, but I think the most obvious is that in most countries, not in the Philippines, but in most countries, there's a geographical nuance to your sports teams. So if you live in, for example, Barcelona or in Madrid, right? So Barcelona is part of the Catalonia region, wherein there's like really high nationalism for Catalonia separatism, etc. Right? So sometimes teams, or sometimes fans have deep connection with their teams because they feel like it represents whatever they come from. Right? So even Madrid fans have really deep antagonism towards Barcelona fans because they feel like Catalonia always wants to get out of Spain, etc. Right? So first is that geographical setting. But even besides that, even in the Philippines, I think it's really the viscerality of sports when people see and feel the thrill of watching the competitive nature of like human beings actually being physically active, even not being physically active, just thinking, like debate or
I don't
chess.
think we have that kind of fans though.
Yeah, to be fair, but you know, it's the competitive nature of it that makes it exciting. So I think a lot of people are hooked because of that.
It might also be the fact that there's a community with which you can interact with. Because I was thinking when Nina said that it's only about sports, I was thinking there's a lot of K-pop fans
the stans.
Yeah, the stans who are super into their boy bands. I don't know what to call them. Their groups. And I'm not really sure why, like in recent months or recent years, the popularity of certain groups started exploding and there are so many fans all the time. They're so passionate also. And maybe I think it might just be related to like the community that goes with standing somebody or a particular group. So it might not just be
unique to
it might, first of all, it might not be unique to sports. It might be unique to places where there's a community that you can bond with. And maybe it's not just about the activity itself, but the people around that.
Definitely.
So I think that perfectly transitions us though to the first part, which is sports and nationalism. So I think there's a long history of issues that come about sports when it comes to nationalism. Well, this isn't the earliest account, but one of the first accounts of like defying the flag would be Tony Smith, which was a basketball captain in Manhattanville College. And she turned her back on the flag in 2013, and basically a lot of people criticized her and attacked, and even our modern version, Colin Kaepernick. Yeah.
NFL. I think most of the people know about it, the kneeling during the US national anthem thing in protest of the racism in the United States, like police brutality, etc. Or even in basketball, wherein LeBron James and other black players wore black shirts during the practice or before the game to show some protest. And it stirred a lot of controversy because not a lot of people actually agree with it, but a lot of people actually support it because they feel like this is what actually sports is about, especially for people who come from marginalized communities like the black.
Yeah.
So this is where the joke comes in, where lots of debaters, including me, used to joke about how, so sarcastically talk about how when you throw this ball, you carry the hopes and dreams of your people, especially in the context of the Olympics. So it's probably not cool to joke about it anymore.
Yeah,
because it's very real.
Like, it sounds ridiculous, but it's true.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people really are hooked by sports, and just the mere act of them winning something, or just even like them participating in the Olympics, is already a big feat for some people, especially the small countries.
Wasn't there a refugee team in a very big sports event before?
The Olympics.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I wasn't sure which
That's
one.
a big sport event.
I wasn't sure which big sports event. That's how out of it I am.
Yeah, basically, yes, there was. So I think there's a huge following behind it. But with this nationalism, I think there are a few issues, like besides race. I think the most prominent one is the issue of basically what we call brawn drain, which is brain drain but for athletes. So countries buying athletes because they want their teams to be stronger. And that's a usual debate that comes out.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think it's also very relevant to the Philippines because we do that a lot, especially in basketball. And we bring in a lot of American players to play here.
Yeah.
Even for the national team, just so they can buff up the height or whatever that is, just so we become competitive.
You don't know what height.
No. Like, no, it's not height all the time. Sometimes it's like heft or whatever. Right?
Oh, yeah.
So, basically, the goal is to make the national team more competitive in the international scene. And sometimes there are a lot of issues about, are they really Filipinos if they just played for the Philippines just because they can't play for the US? Because they're not as good. So
they're not good in the US, but when they go here, they're pro, basically.
There are a lot of, like, things that are said like that. But we can never be certain, obviously. But these are issues that I think are very relevant. Because, sports is rarely about sports. I always say it to my teammates or like to people who ask me how to win sports motions. I tell them the way to win sports motions is to make it not about sports. And a lot of things.
It's your judges
a lot
don't
of
know
things
about sports either.
Well, that's a sad reality, but I think that should change.
Yeah, that's why we invite.
That's true.
Yeah, welcome, Ferdin.
So, anyway, going back to the point. So, I think race and nationality is really tied to even how certain athletes act within the field or within the court.
Yeah. I think this brings us to the implicit racism that happens. Like, the reason why we import Americans is because we have this weird belief that Filipinos are inherently weaker because of some pseudoscience that claims that we're a weaker race altogether, or our genetics weren't made for basketball and we shouldn't attempt it. So this is an age-old debate, and Kyle's very passionate about this, like how science can be a liar sometimes. So in the olden times, the reason why blacks were looked down upon is because they didn't really believe that they were capable of joining sports. So you can see this in battles with Jack Johnson in 1910 versus Jim Jeffries. So Jack Johnson was a black boxer, and he won his divisions. But then Jim Jeffries, who was white, was like, you're just winning because you're in your category. If you tried to defeat me, you wouldn't do well. Obviously, Jackson won. But that racism still exists.
But you know why that originally came about, right? Because the pseudoscience supporting it was that the skulls of African Americans are just smaller compared to those of a white person.
Are they though?
No. So that's racist. But the science of the time was saying that their brains were smaller. That's why, like what you said earlier, boxing was originally about slaves, it was cockfighting, but with blacks. The reason why that happened was because people thought that the whites thought that black people, since they had smaller brains, were not capable of the discipline that's necessary for actual athletes. Okay, so science is a liar sometimes.
Basically.
Because science, contrary to popular belief, is also not completely objective.
Yes.
It is also political.
Yes, exactly. Which brings me perfectly to international relations, which I want to talk about. So the two here didn't want to talk about this, but I think it's very important. It's the only part I can truly contribute myself to. Okay, international relations. I think that sports has had a really long history with how countries interact with each other. Even the fact that we trade players, like Ferdin mentioned, or the Olympics' existence is all rooted in IR. So I have 5 points of matter I want to discuss. Because this is my time to shine also in sports. So one, I think, is if you look at Wake Forest basketball all-star Josh Howard, and he said that the U.S. war on Iraq is all about oil. He said this in 2003, and Howard was basically criticized for questioning the war that was taking place with Iraq, to the point that the NBA draft reports stated that anti-war remarks reflect rumored erratic behavior. There was this weird discrimination towards people who were politically active. Like to them, athletes shouldn't have any political opinion at all. So the next point of matter I want to discuss is Muhammad Ali. Basically, he was jailed for refusing to be drafted. And I think the political issue here is, should athletes and politics be separate? Just because you're an icon and you're looked up upon doesn't mean you have to be given more penalties. Basically, he refused to be drafted. And the penalty in the US is like 18 months.
He didn't get any.
No, he got 5 years instead because he's a public figure. So he got more flack because he's a sports icon. It's a double-edged sword. You get benefits for being an athlete, but it also means that the repercussions on you are stronger. Like, I think that a lot of athletes kneeled, right? But why is Colin Kaepernick the center of it? Why did he get the flack? It's because he had more power. He had more influence. Right? So I think that basically points that it's a double-edged sword. The third thing is what Kyle already mentioned, like the refugee Olympic team. So I think the issue here is, should Olympics still be based on nationality? If we have so many people who don't identify with any nation.
Yeah, like an instance of this is the Iraqi Kurdistan football national team. And they actually play a lot and a lot of games with other countries as well. But they cannot participate in even the qualifiers for the FIFA World Cup because they're not recognized by other states as well. So FIFA does not recognize them as an official team in the international community. So they're forced to play in the Olympics of refugees. So they play with other probably non-recognized states as well. And they have their own like World Cup. They call it the Vivo World Cup. I'm not sure if it's still running until now, but obviously it doesn't get as much traction as the real World Cup.
And that's pretty sad because I heard that team is really strong.
Yeah.
No, I just remembered because we did a round about this.
Yeah.
I don't think you were in it.
Yeah, I wasn't in it.
Yeah, I lost that. I didn't know it.
Yeah, so basically just the refugee team, like an avenue for players to compete. I think it also proves that sports is a way to like uphold advocacies.
Yeah.
Like the reason why the Olympics allowed refugee teams wasn't just to be inclusive, it's to raise awareness for the refugee crisis, which I think was great. Of course, no one really cared. They just focused on the sport. But it was a good attempt, I think. The fourth example I think is very relevant in IR is the Unification Flag of North Korea and South Korea. So despite the war internally, they managed to push those aside and join the Olympics together.
Yeah.
I think that was... I think it's just tokenistic, but it's a good first step.
Well, to be fair, both Koreas aim for unification anyway. I think it's only in the Olympics where their goals truly align. Whereas we need to represent Korea's. But almost every other aspect, they're opposed to one another.
Yeah.
So maybe like it's important because sometimes in sports, it might be the only way for different countries to have a common ground.
I think that was one of the main reasons the Olympics was made as well. Like, besides it being a proxy for war, it was also a way for them to look past differences. Like, I think the common ground for everyone, regardless of their race, is their ability to enjoy sports and physical activity. I think that's like the frame I usually use. Am I right for this?
Yeah.
Except for debaters.
And I think it's pretty like sustainable because right now, like I'm just reading it, and apparently North Korea and South Korea want to jointly host the 2032 Olympics together. So like it just shows that they're actually looking far ahead than just like the unification of a team in the Olympics. They actually really want to make this something long term. They want to make this something that's institutionalized for both Koreas.
So I think like how you use this matter in a debate is just to prove that sports is not just sports for sports sake. It's also a political tool. The last matter is how Assad in Syria actually uses his football team to appease his citizens. So, Ferdin, you told me about this.
Yeah. Syria. So for some context, Syria was surprisingly really, really good, at least for the past few years in the Asian Cup. The Asian Cup is like the counterpart of a World Cup in Asia, right? And Syria almost qualified for the FIFA World Cup in 2022 and in 2018. In 2018, and a lot of people were actually really, really like shocked that it happened because they didn't even know that there were even soccer players in Syria even during the war. But what Assad is doing is he's using the Syrian football team to actually, as a political tool, like as a political symbol for like proving the legitimacy of this regime to its citizens. So there are a lot of things that are happening. Like even the football players cannot speak on any political matters during the game, even before the game or after the game. And there was an instance wherein a football player was actually jailed and was actually killed because of being he had some kind of activist tendencies. And Assad didn't like that.
Okay. So basically, the reason I ranted about these 5 examples is just to prove to the world, to the listeners, and to Ferdin and Kyle that IR is very important in sports as well. And I think that what I usually do is because I specialize in IR. I make all sports motion about IR. And I maybe I can beat Ferdin one day, but probably not.
Oh, like I think one important fact about dictators in sports. Well, actually not dictators, just
authoritarian leaders.
Authoritarian
Yes.
leaders. Okay. In China, what's his name? Xi Jinping, right. I'm thinking of a player. Sorry, Xi Jinping is a really, really big football fan.
Oh.
I read one of his statements about football, and he's a really big football fan. And he invested a lot in the Chinese Football League to the point that even the Chinese Football League has bought a lot of players from Europe. So if you read about it, there are a lot of European players and Brazilian players now in the Chinese Football League. So they really want to make their dream is to win the World Cup someday. And again, like going back to the point earlier, like they're grooming the kids to become a part of a really, really good national team. So it just shows how sometimes you use sports to actually, I don't know,
legitimize yourself, look better. It's a form of soft power now. It's like appeasing to the rest of the international community, like, hey, pay attention to us, we're good people, etc.
Do you think there could be a debate about those athletes who are imported from Europe into China, like they have to boycott something or what, to take a principled stance on something?
Yeah, definitely, because there are also some, I think, if we're talking about like the issues China is in right now, like for instance the Muslims in northwest China, there are a lot of also like Muslim football players that are playing in China. So I don't know, it may be. Oh, actually, there is one basketball player in the Chinese football team who is part of the Muslim minority. Like he's literally from Xinjiang, I think. Some province that has a Muslim, like is Muslim dominated, and he's part of the national team. So probably there's some leeway for debate on that.
Noted. Future edge courses, Charlotte. Okay. What do you want to end this on, Kyle? You haven't talked in a while.
I literally just talked.
Oh, okay, fine.
By the way, the reason why I know that is because when I was watching Philippines versus China, I was so like weirded out by one particular surname in the Chinese team because all of them were like Chinese sounding names, right? I don't want to sound racist, but like you get that. It's a Chinese sounding name.
Okay.
Yes, but
of all the places to say that.
But there's this one name that sounds different from all the other names, and it's Abdul Shalamu. And it's like, I searched on it, and apparently he's part of the Uyghur Muslim
minority. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know what I think is really weird about this is that, for example, in the Philippines, on one hand, a lot of people complain about foreign players who are doing really well. It's like, they're not even Filipinos. They're not even Filipinos. They don't even have the right to play here. And then at the same time, they're also the ones who are likely to say, but sports shouldn't be political. Leave the politics out of it. So there's sort of like
a dissonance.
Yeah, dissonance with how we treat sports in relation to politics and nationalism.
It's a really beefy aspect of sports. I think because sports right now is seen as very regional or very tied to one's national identity. Yeah. Like there are motions and debates right now, in other circuits at least, about making sports nationless, like not having an element of national identity.
Oh, really? So how do they compete with each other?
Just brackets, I guess.
As
individuals, yeah.
Oh.
So not being part of a team, just competing as, just create your own team, or if it's a solo sport, you're not like representing a country, just representing your own name.
So the argument would probably be about like the meaning of sports or the purpose of sports isn't to represent a particular area or particular country, but it's to represent human capability or humanity as a whole.
Yeah, it's possible. But I would think it would create a lot of controversy. Especially now in the Philippines. Because I don't know if you know him, but we have this really good GM in chess. His name is Wesley So. And the Philippine government wasn't supporting him. So what he did was to go to the US and be a player for the US team. So now he's winning a lot of things, but he's not Filipino. He's a US citizen. Because he didn't feel the support of the Philippine government.
But I think that's an argument in support of a nationless sports.
So to be fair.
Because in that way, we can just recognize him for who he is. And we're more likely to attribute that skill to his being Filipino as opposed to his US citizenship. Because it wouldn't matter.
But maybe I'm also thinking that if that were the case, then there's less of an incentive to support them. Like, lots of sports need a lot of resources for them to get better. So if you make sports nationless, then there's literally no incentive for governments to even fund these people.
That's a econ angle, I guess. Yeah?
Yes, we're just debating.
I think
Unless the corporations step in. Right? Because they feel like sports is profitable anyway. If the government isn't there, they will just take the helm.
Do it themselves.
Are there
Privatization of
dangers?
sports.
Are there dangers to sports being completely dominated by private interests like corporations?
There are a lot. And at the top of my head, what I'm thinking is ticket prices. Because if you're profit-oriented, obviously, you don't have any incentive to listen to the fans. But they will watch, right? They don't
Because
care.
the demand is inelastic.
The demand is inelastic.
Oh, I'm learning.
So, like example of this is England football, right? A lot of business moguls are actually buying a lot of clubs in England. So, if you read about it, like Manchester City, the richest club in England right now, got bought by a business mogul from the Middle East named Sheikh Mansour. And he put a lot of money into it. But at the same time, you can argue that it's good because there's a lot of money in sports. But you lose control as to what that team actually is about if you give a lot of private interest control of that team.
And do you think it might also victimize the players, the athletes themselves? Because I heard that, I read recently that, especially in sports, the way they make contracts is different in the sense that there's very little bargaining power for the athletes to get anything out of it. There are morality clauses and some other clauses in sports employment contracts that prevent an individual athlete from participating in other activities like maybe hang gliding, scuba diving. And sometimes those clauses are so vague that some people say that they should be unconstitutional. Like, this dude named John Rocker was a baseball athlete, and he signed an employment contract, saying that he shouldn't do anything that are against the best interests of baseball. So, what the hell even are the interests of baseball, and how do you violate the interests of baseball? But to be fair, what happened to him was he said bad things about gays, about immigrants, about New York, the place, and also punk rock for some reason. And that's the reason why the league was able to punish him. So my point here is that maybe in this world, it's more likely that these corporations will be able to prey on these individual athletes that aren't that good. They're not good enough to demand all these different things. Yeah.
And I think this is a bit relevant. Recent motion I gave in slide up when it's a motion about 50% plus one ownership for fans, and they limit the ownership of corporations to 49%, especially in Germany. And that seeks to, like, at least not just a piece, but just control the amount of power a corporation has over a team. And I think that's debatable as well. Yes, that's why I give it a motion, right? Yeah, but like.
#debatable.
Because I think, in as much as these things are important, like the way sports progresses necessitate a lot of financial capital as well. And I think corporations are just much more able to do that than states, because obviously states have other priorities as well. So it's just hard to justify you giving a lot of money into sports and not doing with other things, other priorities. But for corporations, sometimes you're just like much more focused in a certain sport, and there's just much more leeway for them to actually give much more money to that certain team in sport.
Okay. Yeah?
Yeah.
The next thing I want to discuss, which is also rather prominent, is the role of gender. Like, if you notice sports and how we view it right now, like, we implicitly assign genders to sports. When you say basketball, the first thing that comes to your mind are men. Like dribbling. Like, you rarely think about the women's team. Or volleyball is predominantly like feminine in the eyes of people.
Not if you watch Haikyuu, but okay.
But right, Haikyuu was made because it wanted to be a counter narrative to that stereotype. Right? So I have matter on this too, Kyle. So basically, I think that it's also subject to pseudoscience. So if blacks were seen as inferior because of their
small brains,
small skulls,
quote unquote small brains.
Quote unquote, Kyle.
Like, if you only listen to that part of the podcast,
if you don't,
oh no,
this will be used against you in the future. But yes, okay, so they're small skulls, quote unquote. Obviously not verified, proven to be untrue small skulls. Women are also discriminated because of their lack of testosterone.
Yes.
Right? Obviously, this is debunked, like the concept that women are weaker. So, two important matter for you to use in debates. There's Billie Jean King, who was a really great female tennis player who was challenged by a man, and she beat him. I don't know his name, he's not relevant because he was basically a sexist person, so I don't want to give him any credit. Or recently, like in figure skating, the highest score that a woman can get in a solo figure skating act is to land a triple axel. Because a quad, or spinning in the air 4 times before landing, or a quad axel, was seen to be impossible for a woman because of the biology and physiology of a woman's body in comparison to a man. But recently, just a few weeks back, Miki Ando landed a quad for the first time. Right? So I think these are constantly proving that women are capable of achieving just the same thing as men. So I think the most prominent debate issue here, and it was a motion recently in Manila InterVarsity where Kyle and I competed in, is gender segregation in sports still needed? Or should we just go about making sports genderless or sexless? What do we call it? Genderless? What do you call it?
Post-gender future?
Yeah, post-gender future in sports, right? What do you think?
Well, I think, for one, even if I agree, like, the separation between men and women are at least now a bit more closer than before. But I think there's still a bit of a physiological advantage for men in most sports. Like, I think it's just a muscle. Like, I'm not being sexist, okay? Like, I'm not being Kyle. But like, there's just it's just human nature that sometimes.
That's a really bad argument.
I don't know how to phrase it, but the point is, there are certain physiological advantages to men that make them
different,
at least on average, different or a bit more able in certain sports.
Are you saying I'm disabled?
Just the sheer amount of testosterone makes you have better endurance, right? In swimming or etc.
Hey, but women can have high testosterone.
Yeah,
Wasn't that the case of Casper Semenya?
Yeah. But not, and it's actually a point of controversy because the expectation is that not all women shouldn't have that level of testosterone. There's apparently probably an arbitrarily imposed level of testosterone that women should have. I didn't know that it was a thing, but apparently there is. That's why Casper Semenya was banned from competing.
Where was she banned from?
Okay, so the context is that Casper Semenya is really good, runner.
Mm-hmm. Track and field. I'm
not sure from which country, but basically, after being tested, it was found out that she had a high level of testosterone, and the International Athletics Federation, etc., eventually banned her from competing just because of that. And the basis of that is apparently because of having a high level of testosterone gave her some kind of physical advantage over other women. So there's an expectation that this is the most a woman could have for testosterone. And actually now it's pretty recent, and I think by the end of April, probably by the end of this podcast, right? I don't know, by next week, the court of arbitration for sports, the international courts, like the ICJ of sports.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The fact that they have that is amazing.
So like they will decide whether or not the IAAF was actually wrong in ruling Caster Semenya as ineligible to compete in international sports, at least in the women category.
I think the difference in testosterone level also brings in an interesting sub-issue in this debate. Like, where do transgenders therefore stand?
Yeah.
Especially those who are still in transitioning. Are they allowed to compete? Do they have a separate category? What category do they belong to? I think this is still a rather fresh field, so I personally don't have the answers to it. But my personal take on this is that I think that they should be given the category based on their capacity. Like the same way that the basis for having women's sports and men's sports is different physiological capabilities. Like maybe transgenders could find, especially in their transitioning phase, where they belong in that spectrum in terms of their transition. I'm not going to discredit what they identify as, but I think for the sake of the sport, their physiological capabilities becomes a factor. At least that's just my take. I think that's the correct way to phrase
That's true.
that argument for this.
But for me though, like what's inherently abhorrent is that it's so easy to call out Caster Semenya being really, really good because she's a woman. But if you notice, no one actually calls out Michael Phelps for being really good, like crazy good. Usain Bolt for being so fast. So like, shouldn't you question like, is Usain Bolt even human? Right? Like,
That's true.
Like,
That's true.
what is human even? Like, where do we set the limits as to when something is acceptable or a physiological capacity is acceptable for it to fall under a category?
Yes.
Right?
So that's like the sub-issue. I think this is a perfect segue though to the last thing I want to discuss, which is the role of doping. Like steroids is a really big issue in sports. If anything, it becomes like a it's not taboo, it's just like an open secret in the field, right?
Well, to be fair, it depends on
The field.
What sport?
the field,
Yeah.
what sport, because in many different sports, it's bad for you to use steroids. But if you remember the Mountain from Game of Thrones, he openly admitted to using steroids for weightlifting, and it turns out that steroid use is actually very acceptable in the context of weightlifting. And so I think it depends on what sport. I think the weird thing here is how do you decide? How do you decide which sport is it okay for there to be steroid use? Which sport is it not okay for there to be steroid use?
Actually, there was a debate about embracing the use of steroids in sports, because one argument you can use is that sports anyway is about testing the human capacity, the limits of the human body.
Yeah.
So what's wrong with using like additives if it's not like gonna destroy your body, if it enhances it actually?
If it's assisted by science,
Yeah.
right? So you already have all these different techniques that are proven by science that can help you build muscle faster or perform better, and all these different techniques. So what is it that makes those things different from steroids? So for example, if I make a really good, protein shake that makes you build muscle really, really fast, how is that different from something that is also artificially created, but we call it steroids?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's about the extents, right? Like, if you know about the issue of Lance Armstrong being stripped of a lot of like cycling titles because like they found out that Lance Armstrong was doping throughout his whole career. Not only did it give an undue advantage to him, right? Like I think a lot of people felt not just cheated, but they feel like when you start manipulating, quote unquote, manipulating your body, you become less of what other people are, right? So if you're a fan, right, you don't want to look at an athlete who is so separate from you because you feel like that person is still a human being. That person's like probably your neighbor, probably someone you know, etc. And if you just like clearly stay away from that, like quote unquote humanity, some people might feel like you're detached from what they are and who they are.
So sports is also about humanity. But again, the question here is, what constitutes human to begin
Well,
with?
that's true.
Like, let's go back to the topic about gender. There isn't really like a set gender. Like there are men, there are women. There's just various shades of gray, and we have so much science that proves that you don't have this monolithic concept that we call a man and expect the same thing to be applicable to everyone. Why do we have this concept of what a human is and we expect it to be applicable to everyone?
Well,
I don't know, Kyle.
It's debatable.
It's debatable.
like, that's the point.
We're not supposed to know the answers, Kyle. That's why we discuss them. I think, though, like another good point is if it's about humanity, that's one way to see it. But what about the other end of the spectrum? What if you're using steroids to keep up with everyone else?
Oh.
What if it's your way of equalizing yourself with the mid-tier athletes? What if you're like scrawny, like Steve Rogers at the start of Captain America? And you're just using this to become like everyone else. Is it still something that we should frown upon? I don't know. It's debatable.
It's debatable.
I think we've reached the point of this podcast that we've exhausted everything. Ferdin, do you have any final notes to discuss that we weren't able to cover?
At least about gender or sex?
Just sports in general. We're at the tail end of the podcast. We've actually reached almost 50 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so if anything, a very interesting facet of sports that I think we weren't able to flesh out as much is the intersection of sports and economics and business. Right?
I think we discussed it slightly with privatization.
I discussed this a lot with Jet.
Okay.
Hi, Jet. And Pep.
Okay.
Anyway, so like, sports, at least for now, gets subsumed under a lot of corporate or private interest. There's just so much money in sports. Like, if you heard about it last year, there was like 300 million euros or 200 million euros that was involved in the transfer of a Brazilian football player named Neymar from Barcelona to Paris. That's 200 million euros, right? So there's just a lot of money. And the way governing bodies in sports try to adapt to this is by institutionalizing what they call now is at least the financial fair play, wherein they limit the amount of spending teams can have according to what their revenue is. So if you only get this profit, this whatever profit, you cannot spend over that profit because it's unsustainable, right? So I think there's a lot of leeway and there's a lot of issues concerning that. Because in as much as I think it's actually good intention, it actually also maintains a lot of hierarchy in sports, right?
That's true.
I think this is very relevant to the motion of Worlds 2017 about redistributing wealth from teams,
amongst
right?
teams,
If you're a really, really rich team to a really poor team, right? Because what will happen is that if you're only able to spend according to what your revenue is, if you're a low revenue team, you are less likely to spend and therefore less likely to get good players. So it's very tricky, and there are a lot of issues surrounding it, like salary caps, like what the maximum contract a player can get, like in the NBA, wherein there's a specific cap for all teams and how they allocate it within their teams, etc. So yeah, I guess people can read about it, and there are a lot of, I guess.
Yeah, you guess. Yeah. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of things. Yeah, we'll probably ask Ferdin in future time to give us some resources that we'll tweet so that everyone can look up sports. So besides the podcast, we'll try to give you some textual aid in case we were too sabaw for you to understand anything we discussed in the past few minutes we were talking.
Or just just be generally knowledgeable about sports, like following sports things like Twitter or whatever, right? Because the first step to actually being interested in it is like actually watching sports.
I'll just follow Ferdin for now. Maybe from there. So you can follow Ferdin. What's your Twitter again?
What is for dinner? It's at what is for dinner.
Like dinner, like Ferdin.
For dinner.
Yeah.
Follow this heartthrob.
Follow this heartthrob. Yes. Learn more about sports. Like he tweets at 3 a.m. about football matches that he stayed up late watching. During NLIV, he didn't sleep until 4 a.m. because he was busy watching a match, and we had debate rounds the next day. But he's a pro, I guess, at balancing his love for sports and debate.
So sports fans in at least Southeast Asia are oppressed. Because we are forced to watch it at like really, really late night.
Well, you chose this life.
That's true.
That's true. So I think that's it. We covered a lot of things. I don't know the recap anymore. I usually give recaps, but this was just really messy. But I had fun.
I also had fun.
Thank you, Ferdin, for being our first guest here on Debatable.
Thank you for having me.
We'll have you again. Probably like sports too. If there are new developments in sports, right? So thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope you liked that we had a guest. Give us your suggestions and what you think we could change or improve in this episode. Again, I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle.
And I'm Ferdin.
Yes, and we'll see you in the next episode of Debatable. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ding ding.